Hey folks, it's Tennessee State Senator Bo Watson. On this episode of Tennessee Today, we talk about the legislative process, how bills move through the committee and ultimately make their way to the floor and ultimately make their way to the governor, and how a bill actually becomes a law. It is really important for people to understand how the legislative process works. It will help you to know when to engage in the process. We also talk about the governor's State of the State address and what he sees as the priorities for the state of Tennessee. And then we talked about some legislation. Obviously, we talked about education. It's always a top priority for the state. Then some other bills we talked about, K-9 medical care bill, as well as a bill dealing with the presidential physical fitness test. I hope you'll take time and tune in to this episode. Do you ever wonder what's really going on in government, locally, in the state of Tennessee, and across the country? I'm Tennessee State Senator Bo Watson, and on Tennessee Today, we dive into the issues that shape our communities, from local policy to national debates. Each episode, I break down key topics and issues, share my perspective from over 20 years in the Tennessee legislature, and talk with guests about the decisions that impact your daily life. I hope you enjoy these honest conversations and that they help you stay informed and engaged. Be sure to like, follow, and subscribe to Tennessee Today wherever you get your podcasts so you never miss an episode. So session begins really the second Tuesday of January officially, but actually session doesn't really start. The legislature really doesn't start doing its work until after the governor has given the State of the State address. And recently, Governor Lee gave the state's State of the State address, which for those of you who follow state government or follow the United States government, it's similar to the President's State of the Union. Governor Lee presents the state of Tennessee, what's happening in Tennessee, but most importantly, he presents his budget proposal to the legislature. So the governor has given his last, because Governor Lee is termed out, so this will be his last year. So he has laid out the budget for the state of Tennessee, and where he proposes that we spend your hard-earned Tennessee tax dollars. Now that budget is before the House and before the Senate, and all of the various members and committees of all the various committee members will start to take up the governor's budget and determine where we spend your hard-earned tax dollars in the coming year. This will continue for the next 3 or 4 months, and probably in the middle of April or the last couple of weeks of April, we will pass the final budget, which really sets in place how we'll be spending Tennessee taxpayer dollars over the course of the next year. A lot of the discussion that we have from now until the end of session is around various pieces of legislation. Some of those cost money, some of those don't cost money. If they don't cost money, they don't have to go before the Finance Committee, which I'm chairman of. They just simply go out of the committee and onto the Senate floor. So I want to talk to you a little bit about how our process works, because a lot of understanding legislation and a lot of understanding the legislature and how legislators act is based on the process. So as I told you, we go into session the second week of January every year. The Constitution requires us to do that. And at that time, members begin filing bills or filing legislation. Now, in the House, a member is limited to only 10 pieces of legislation. If you are a committee chairman, you can have, I think, up to 15 pieces of legislation. So you can do the math. There are 99 members in the House. They are limited to 10 bills, so that's 990 pieces of legislation that potentially could be introduced. And then let's say you have 10 chairmen, so there's an additional 50 bills that you could introduce. So roughly the House could introduce about 1,000 or a little over 1,000 pieces of legislation every year. Now, our legislative cycle is over 2 years, so in theory, a single member of the House of Representatives could introduce up to 30 bills over the 2-year period, which equals up to 2,000 bills as the whole body goes. So 2,000 pieces of legislation. In the Senate, where I serve, we don't have any limits on the number of bills that we can introduce. So you'll have, again, 1,000, 1,500 pieces of legislation that will be introduced in the first few weeks of session. We have a specific date, usually around the 1st of February, where we call it the bill filing deadline, which means you've got from the beginning of January to the end of January to file all your legislation. And then we have a bill cutoff and you can't file any more legislation. The reason we do that is that at that point, the public can look at the legislative website and you can see the full universe of bills that are being proposed. You can see the things that you like. You can see the things that you dislike. You can get an idea of what the legislature is going to be focusing on. And we'll talk about a few of those things during today's show. But the main thing to understand is that there's a limited number of bills that a House member can file. There is a specific time frame for which those bills can be introduced. So if our session runs from January to the 1st of May, you're not going to see all of a sudden a new bill introduced the 1st of May. We just can't do that. We are limited by the bill filing cutoff. So understanding, when bills are moving and how that works is really, really important to understanding how to engage with the legislature. Now, it gets more complicated because once the bills get introduced, so those go to a person that's called the clerk. And there's a clerk in the House and there's a clerk in the Senate. And their responsibility is to look at the bill, organize the bill, decide which committee does this bill go to. Now, people in Tennessee, the Tennessee Constitution requires that every bill that comes before the legislature has to be read 3 times. The first time it's read is it's given to the clerk. The clerk posts it on the House and Senate calendar, and that's the first acknowledgement that this piece of legislation exists. So people from the state of Tennessee can go to the legislative website and see all of the bills that have been introduced on first reading. Then a couple of days later, those same bills are published on the legislative website, and that constitutes the second reading. Remember, they have to be read 3 times. So that constitutes the second reading. At that point, the clerk takes the bill and whatever the subject matter is of the piece of legislation, sends it to the appropriate committee. So if it's a bill to increase the amount of time someone spends in prison, that goes to the Judiciary Committee. If it's a bill that's to decrease taxes, that goes to the Finance Committee. If it's a bill about roads and bridges, that goes to the Transportation Committee. So all of the bills have a specific subject matter, and that particular subject matter determines what committee that bill will be debated in. We are a committee-driven system, which means most of the activity around legislation is going to be in the committee. Out of roughly 1,000 bills that are filed, maybe 400 to 500 of those actually ever become law. So most pieces of legislation get to the committee, and that's where they're debated, and they're never moved out of the committee to the full Senate floor. The bill goes to the committee takes it up. Now, there are some bills that have to do with multiple subject areas. Like you might have a bill that deals with education, but also deals with judiciary, something around, let's say, truancy. So if you're passing a bill on truancy, its first stop might be with the Judiciary Committee. But because truancy deals with education, it also then might, after it comes out, if it comes out of judiciary, it might go to the Education Committee. And if that bill happened to spend taxpayer money, it also would go to the Finance Committee. So before the full body would hear a piece of legislation, that particular legislation on truancy, it would have gone through Judiciary, Education, and Finance. And all of those committees have the ability to stop the bill at that point. We use the terminology kill the bill, meaning that the bill doesn't proceed forward, or can amend or change the bill. And any of those 3 committees can change the bill, and they can make it different than what it started. So oftentimes what I try to tell folks when they're looking at legislation, when it first gets introduced, is, give the bill a little bit of time to see what it's actually going to do, because a lot of bills that first get introduced are going to get amended and they'll be changed over time. So what you thought was happening at the very beginning is not what happens at the very end, because committees look at the bill from their perspective, and they amend or change the bill as they see necessary to make the legislature make the bill better. The work of the committee is intended to make the bill better. It's also to create the public debate, the forum where we have public debate on pieces of legislation. So we are a committee-driven system. Once a bill comes out of the final committee, it is then in the Senate, it goes to what's called a calendar committee who decide when are we going to hear the bill on the Senate floor, and its next stop is the Senate floor. Same thing happens in the House. Once a bill gets to the floor, and the floor is where all members can participate in the debate. Remember, at the committee level, only the committee members are participating in the debate on a piece of legislation. When it gets to the floor, all 99 members of the House can debate the bill. All 33 members of the Senate can debate the bill. And then there is an ultimate vote of the two chambers about whether the bill passes or fails. Now, you can have a bill that passes in the Senate and fails in the House, or you can have a bill that passes in the House and fails in the Senate. For the bill to go to the governor to actually be signed into law, both chambers have to pass it, and both chambers have to pass the exact same bill. Now, here's how that works. Remember I told you about the committees, that there are committees in the House, committees in the Senate, and they can amend the bill and change the bill. Many times, the Senate committees change the bill differently than the House committees change the bill. Now, bills can't pass at the same time. It's the same bill, but it can't pass at the same time. So let's say, just for example, the Senate has a bill, it amends it into committee system, it comes to the Senate floor, and it passes. That bill is then transmitted from the Senate over to the House and waits there for the same bill to move through the committee system in the House. When that bill comes out of the House committees and comes to the House floor, let's say the House has amended it differently. So the bill that came over from the Senate, now remember, these bills started exactly the same. That first reading, the first reading in the Senate, the first reading in the House, exact same bill. Then they go to the committees. That bill that comes up from the House, now it looks different than the bill that the Senate sent over, that the Senate passed. What generally happens is the Senate bill that's waiting in the House passes their bill. When it comes up, the House says, you know what? We don't like the Senate version. We like the House version. We're going to substitute our version for the Senate version and send it back over to the Senate and say, look at what we've done to the bill. What do you think about it? That bill comes back over to the Senate, and the Senate can say, oh, we like those changes. We agree with those changes. We're going to concur in those changes. We vote on it, and the bill goes up to the governor to be signed into law. Many times, most of the time, the Senate says, we don't like the changes that the House made. We're sending this bill back over to the House and ask them to reconsider their actions. So it goes back over to the House to be reconsidered. Most of the time, the House members say, well, we like our version better than the Senate version. We're going to send it back over to them, tell them we're not making any changes to it. Send it back over. That creates a process where the bill then goes to what is called a conference committee. And you hear about this all the time at the federal level. You don't hear as much about it at the state level. But almost every bill at the federal level, you'll hear them talk about a conference committee. The conference committee, there are members from the Senate and members from the House who come together to work out the differences between the two bills that have passed both chambers. If they're able to come to an agreement, and sometimes they're not, but if they're able to come to an agreement, then they basically rewrite the bill and send it back to the House, send it back to the Senate, and both chambers decide, are we going to vote on this bill and are we going to pass it as the conference committee has suggested it to us? If we don't, if it fails, then the bill is dead for that year. If we do and it passes, then it gets passed in the House, gets passed in the Senate. It then goes to the governor for the governor's signature. All that to say, the legislative process is really complicated. And for people who aren't playing in the game, it's like if you've never played baseball before and somebody just sticks you out there, it's hard to understand how the rules are played. But if you understand the rules and you watch baseball, you can understand why the players are doing certain things on the field. The same thing's true with the legislature. If you understand the process, if you understand how bills move and how committees work and what members sit on what committees, you can then begin to watch the process and understand why members are doing certain things with pieces of legislation, because ultimately they understand the rules of the game just like the players on the baseball field understand the rules of the game. And the spectators who understand the rules can better understand how the process works and then be better engaged in the legislative process, which is critically important to a democratic republic like we have here in the United States. And that's true at the state level. It's equally true at the federal level. It's just more difficult at the federal level because you're dealing with 50 states and 350 million people represented versus the state of Tennessee, where you're dealing with one state represented by 132 members representing 7 million Tennesseans. That's how the process works. Let's talk about a few pieces of legislation that you might want to be interested in as the session gets going. One of the things I enjoy most about the legislative session is that you're never really sure exactly what bills are going to get the most attention. Former United States Senator Lamar Alexander had a famous saying where he said, don't be surprised when the small thing becomes the big thing. Every year we know that we're going to have a pretty robust debate about public education because public education is the most expensive thing in state government. It's the most expensive thing in local government. And so we know we're always going to have, robust debate about how we spend education dollars. Healthcare is the second most expensive thing that we fund in state government. So we always know we're going to have some robust debate about healthcare because, where your money is often determines how important something is. So because those two take up so much of the state's budget, they're always going to get a lot of attention. But then you never know what the outlier is going to be. You never know. Is it going to be about, litter on the roads? That's often one that people get really cranked up about, and there's legislation to address how we deal with litter on the roads. Is it going to be around property taxes? Is it going to be around sales tax? I mean, all of these things, you never know which one is going to be the one that stirs the most imagination. In recent years, we've had a lot of conversation, and I suspect there will be continued conversation this year in the legislature about immigration because, states historically have not played in the immigration space. And now over the past 3 to 5 years, particularly in the past 2 years, you've seen states really leaning in more and more on immigration. So will we have a lot of debate about immigration this year? It's hard to predict where the public will decide what they think is the most important issue once you get past education and once you get past healthcare. A couple of things that I am watching that I think the public will be really interested in the education space, education freedom scholarships. That is school choice is a philosophy that we have adopted here in Tennessee pretty aggressively. For a family or a student in the state of Tennessee, the options that you have on how you get educated in K-12 education is really, really the menu of choices is quite immense. I mean, here locally in Chattanooga, you've got traditional public schools, you've got public charter schools, you've got magnet schools, you've got academies, you've got private schools, you've got parochial schools, and of course we've got a strong homeschooling component, particularly in my Senate district. I mean, the amount of choices that families have is incredible. And because of that, we've seen test scores, and we've talked about this on other shows, we've seen test scores going up in Tennessee because we're giving more and more options to families about what they believe is the best choice in the way that they educate their children. But we will have debate as the governor's proposing increasing the number of freedom education scholarships that we have in the state. That will be a big driver of the conversation we have. Inevitably, we will have a conversation about taxes and tax proposals. We focus most of the time in Tennessee on about reducing taxes because we truly believe that the more money we keep in your pocket, the more money you will spend. And since we are a sales tax-driven state, you will turn the dollars over more if we leave it for you to make a decision on where you spend your money rather than the government deciding where you spend your money. So I expect that we're going to have a pretty robust debate about property taxes. All across the state in Tennessee this year, we saw double-digit increases in property taxes. And taxpayers somewhat caught unexpectedly and off guard with the amount of their property tax increase. So there are a number of proposals in the legislature this year to try and control how much local government can increase your property taxes so that there is at least some predictability about what those taxes look like. And that really fits into just the sort of the fiscal mindset, the financial mindset of the state of Tennessee, predictability, taxpayers knowing what their costs are going to be in terms of taxes, how we control our spending because we actually limit how much revenue we allow the state to have. Those are actually really good policy positions, and I think will be a lot of discussion. Now, obviously, the concern that local government's going to have is that most of local government's funds come from property taxes. So there will be discussion between the state legislature and local governments about what these kind of property taxes look like. Just to remind you, on the ballot in November, there will be a constitutional amendment which will ask the citizens of Tennessee, do we want to eliminate the property tax as a statewide property tax, meaning state implementing a property tax? So don't forget to vote on that and choose wisely. But these bills will deal with local property taxes. How do the city of Chattanooga or how does Hamilton County, what are they allowed to do with their property tax and their property tax rate? So I think that's a really, really important bill. Another bill that I'm kind of excited about that's one of my colleagues in the House, Representative Michelle Renault's bill, is a bill dealing with how we deal with injured K-9s. There was some discussion about this last year, but there wasn't a piece of legislation introduced. People would be surprised to know, I think, that you can't, if a police officer K-9 or dog is injured while on duty, there isn't really an emergency medical system response for that. In the current system, the officers there or someone there simply loads the animal up into their personal vehicle or their patrol car and takes them to the veterinarian. Because of the increased use of K-9s in active policing duties and other types of duties, search and rescue, those kind of things, the increasing activity of those, Representative Renault and I have a bill that would allow for emergency medical personnel to treat injured K-9s on site as well as to transport them in emergency medical vehicles. Obviously, there will be veterinary input on this because, these aren't humans, they're K-9s, and the way veterinarians manage injuries is different than the way medical doctors might manage injuries. But the message here is that, in our world today, K-9s are a part of our law enforcement and emergency rescue services. They are an important piece of that, and they need to be provided the same kind of medical care, veterinary care that our police officers, firemen, and others are provided. So stay tuned for that bill. I think that's going to be a really interesting discussion. Several states have adopted this kind of legislation to make sure we're taking care of these types of officers, which is part of the rescue and law enforcement workforce now. Another piece of legislation that I have that I hope you'll be interested in is a reinstatement of the traditional presidential physical fitness test. Under the Obama administration, roughly about 10 years ago, they sort of reformatted it to make it a little bit more user-friendly. And quite honestly, they made it kind of educational, but really removed the competitive side of it to where performance was a key part of the fitness test. Now, what Representative Sapicki and I are reintroducing, and of course, this could be restructured somewhat at the federal level, but we're trying to reintroduce the competitive side of the presidential physical fitness test. The reason for that is I think it's important for youth to understand that competition is a healthy thing. And you compete you're going to be competing throughout the rest of your life. And so creating an atmosphere where we combine competition with physical fitness is a good thing. And so what this bill tries to do is combine those things together where students, again, are competing, but they're also learning about a healthy lifestyle and what that means. People talk a lot about transparency in government, and I just want y'all to understand that Tennessee, I mean, we're incredibly transparent. You can see all of our committee hearings online. You just need to go to the legislative website. All the bills, all the amendments are online. You have access to your legislative members via email. I mean, I just think in Tennessee, we are really working hard to make everything that we do as transparent as possible. Now, if you don't understand the process, it may be difficult to see the transparency. But once you understand the process that we've talked about, you can kind of plug yourself in, and it really allows you to really engage yourself. And I encourage you to engage yourself in the legislative process. You know, those of us that are in elected office, contrary to popular opinion, we really covet public's input. It's not whether you agree or you disagree with me. It's that I'm getting input, I'm getting feedback. Sometimes we put bills out just to see if there's public interest, what the public feedback will be. A perfect example of that would be here locally where we were looking at using some park space, area that is currently designated as park space, and rezoning it from park to commercial. We were actually talking about this was a proposal that came from our local mayor about repurposing the land from being a park space to being commercial space for commercial industrial development. And we got a ton of public feedback that they didn't like that idea. And that's good. And ultimately the mayor decided that, okay, we're not going to do that because the public's not interested in that. When the public engages in the political process, in the decision-making process, that is a healthy thing for elected folks. I don't take it as a negative. I take it as a positive when the public gives me feedback, whether they agree or they disagree with me. It helps me in my decision-making. And that's why, podcasts like this, other things that you might listen to, learning about the legislative process, following legislation, listening to the news, that's why those things are so important. Our system depends on citizens engaging themselves in the process. And when they don't like something, they need to engage themselves. When they do like something, they need to engage themselves. All too often, those of us in elected office, we hear from the critics and not from the people who actually support the things that we're doing. And many times when we get out and we move around in public spaces, we find out that actually there are a lot more people that support us than there are that are critical of us, but they're not the ones who speak out. And so we do try and balance what we're hearing online or what we're seeing in social media or letters that we're receiving versus things that we might be hearing from people when we're actually engaging with the public at meetings and those kind of things. This has been another episode of Tennessee Today. I'm Tennessee State Senator Bo Watson. Listen, if you have not subscribed, would you take a moment, please, and subscribe? It helps to make sure that you don't miss a single episode. And there are some really good ones coming. There's some good ones behind, but there were some really good ones coming. So if you would just take a moment and do me the favor of clicking the subscribe button, I'd greatly appreciate it.